Okay, great. Now, whenever it does that, Lois, it always messes my screen up. I have to go back and, okay, here we go. All right, so welcome everyone. I'm Jay Malone. I'm still the newest director of ACRL, started in September of 2021. My first name is Robert, and so if you wanted to send an email to me, it would be rmalone@ala.org, and that's sort of the shorthand for wanting to contact anyone at ALA. It's the first initial, the first name, and the last name @ala.org. And one of the things I like to do is use Robert because I'm named after my librarian Uncle Bob, Robert Tucker, who was Furman's head librarian for over 40 years, was an ALA member for 82 years, which may be some kind of record. So when I'm using Robert, I'm kind of channeling Uncle Bob there. Okay, so the next slide, Lois. Thank you.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. Do we want to do a quick introduction since some of us might not know each other, Jay?
Oh, yeah, sorry. That's a good idea. If you could, let's see, I'll call on you. And if you could just tell us briefly, name, where you are zooming in from, and just any kind of past relevant experience would be great. And so, Katie, I'll start with you.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie O'Neill. I am the director of the Loyola Notre Dame Library. Our library is a little bit unique in that we are one of only 2 in the United States that supports 2 different universities. So I actually am a separate 501c3 myself. I started as the director in October of 2021, but I've been with this library for 10 years, and I was in the associate director role before that, and did a lot of work with our own finance committee and board on redesigning our finances for the library to be compliant with things like accounting standards, external reporting, and all those kind of good things, and implemented a 3-year lookout budget review process that is used to this date. So
that'll come in handy. Thank you, Katie. Maju, am I pronouncing your name correctly? I'm glad to be corrected.
Yeah, you did it. You did it good.
Okay.
Yeah. My name is Madhu Karyala. I'm the Electronic Resources and Serials Librarian at Atlanta University Center. Well, I've been working here for the past 3 years. And before that, I was Acquisitions Librarian at Alabama State University. And before that, I have a lot of years of experience with public libraries. And I've enjoyed every year of my professional development and everything. So I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Thank you, Madhu. Beth, you go next.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Beth Mcneil. I'm the Dean of Libraries at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana, and the Vice President of ACRL. And I'll apologize. I have to stay on mute a lot because of construction happening right below my office today.
Okay. That seems to be eternal.
Till November.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. Thank you. Thank you, Beth. Robert? No.
Hi, everybody. Robert McDonald, Dean of Libraries at the University of Colorado Boulder. It's great to see you all.
Thank you. Good to see you. Joe?
Hello, everybody. I'm sorry I'm a little late. I just walked into my office. So I'm Joe Mochnik. I'm the Dean of Libraries at Kansas State University. I'm so excited to be here. I've been on this committee for several years, 2 terms, I think, and I'm the incoming chair, and I'm really excited for everybody who is remaining and who is joining us, and I'm really excited about this opportunity. I think we have a wonderful crew and great support from ACRL and from elsewhere, and I really appreciate this group a lot.
Thank you, Joe. And we have a terrific team at ACRL, and I'll ask Alea, our newest person, to help us out, to introduce herself.
Hi all, my name is Alea. I've been working under Allison for ACRL, and this is about my 4th or 5th week. So this is my first introduction to your committee, and I'm really excited.
Thank you, Ellie. Elois?
And my name is Loyola Sharp. It would probably be good if I put my camera on. But I'm Loyola Sharp, and I am one of the staff liaisons for the Budget and Finance Committee.
Thank you, Lois. And Allison?
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Allison Payne. I'm the ACRL Program Manager for Strategic Initiatives. I've been with ACRL for a little over 9 years. I mainly support the Budget and Finance Committee, the Board of Directors, and our EDI initiatives.
Thank you. Now, did I get everyone? Is that, make sure I haven't skipped over anyone. Okay.
You got everybody.
Okay, thank you, Lois. Okay, now I'm ready for the next slide. Okay, so our meeting outcomes. Eightfold here. We're hoping that at the end of the meeting, you'll have a deeper understanding of Budget and Finance's role in ACRL, a deeper understanding of ALA's budgeting process and the timelines in relation to ACRL's budget, and that's a topic that's fluid, and so we'll be revising how ACRL makes its budget up in conjunction with ALA moving forward. We're hoping you'll have familiarity with ACRL's budget timeline, a deeper understanding of the budget basics and practices, familiarity with ACRL budget documents, including the budget executive summary, individual project budgets, and quarterly reports. And any of you who have seen the budget for the first time might be astounded by the number of tabs, and we always stand ready to work with you and to go through that to help you understand better how the budget is set up. We also hope to have an understanding of committee work plan and how each member will contribute to that work plan, a deeper understanding of ALA's finances and the context for ACRL's finances. And then introduction to ALA's operating agreement and business rules under which ACRL operates. And again, that's something that is a lot of changes that have been coming in the past couple of months. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So here's the committee roster. So if we misspelled your name or someone's missing, please let us know, but 15 total members, 13 voting members, which means that we need to have 7 members for a quorum. And you can see that we have the staff liaisons listed along with the dates for service. And next slide. So I thought I'd start with a quick review of the committee charge. One thing I want to do is to underscore that Choice is a part of ACRL, and Rachel Hendrick, who is the interim publisher and editor of Choice, you'll see her. She'll be making presentations of Choice's finances at future meetings. And she is interim replacing Mark Cummings, who was the Choice editor publisher for some 8 years and retired on April Fool's Day of 2022. So the third bullet here, it may involve work on the impact of the proposed change to operating agreement. To counsel the ACRL Board of Directors on questions regarding all fiscal matters. And that's something that we'll want to touch on later. Next slide. Okay, how budget and finance works. So the budget and BARC, Budget Assembly Review Committee, is a liaison. That liaison is important, and that's going to be determined for 22-23. Our new treasurer, effective July 1st, is Peter Hepburn, who is an ACRL member. And he can be contacted in the meanwhile, and there's his email, excuse me, you don't see it, but his email address, I can actually copy this and put it in the chat, peter.hepburn@canyons.edu. Typically in January, the committee meets 3 times, BNF 1, BNF 2, and then the joint board BNF meetings. which we're planning to schedule as virtual meetings. And I think we're already sending out some doodle polls to try to see the best time for that. We ask that you do attend. Attendance is required, and scheduling will be based on that availability. And then in June, there are typically 2 meetings, BNF 1 and BNF 2. And again, we look for full participation, and staff will be in contact to determine if these meetings will should be virtual or in person in Chicago. So for the LibLearnX meeting in January in New Orleans, just as a reminder, that used to be midwinter, and there used to be governance associated with that. Now that's changed quite dramatically, but we'll have these governance meetings that won't conflict with the dates of LibLearnX, but are in sort of conjunction with that. And then the Chicago meeting is planned to be in person, so who knows how the pandemic will work, but that's if you're putting your calendars together, June 2023, to put that in pencil at least for that. Okay, next slide. Thank you. These 3 bullets outline how BNF's Budget and Finance serves as an advisory committee to the board. So the role is to approve the budget, taking into consideration the committee's recommendations, and to monitor ACRL's financial solvency. And so the Budget and Finance is important in helping the board exercise that role. So as an advisory committee. And one of the ways that we help facilitate communication between board and Budget and Finance is this joint meeting that we mentioned that will be January or February sometime. Okay, so the ACRL budget timeline. So this shows the annual cycle for the creation and approval of the budget. ALA accounting is behind on releasing performance reports. As of mid-July, we only had financial actuals through January 2022 for our fiscal year. So the reports in the fall for the final closes may be delayed, although Dina Sardinas, our Chief Financial Officer, is trying to give us more timely reports. And I learned this morning that we can expect the February reports before the end of this week, which is good news. And the hope is, and what Dina has been telling the ALA board, is that we'll have I think up through June by mid-September. So they're trying to catch up as quickly as they can. But one of the things that we've been telling ALA and finance is that these timely financial reports are essential for helping us make all sorts of decisions and all sorts of planning. So in the upper left, you can see the timeline starts with the assumptions in the fall. The staff used the assumptions to create the preliminary budget for Budget and Finance discussion at what used to be the midwinter meeting. And this is a careful document that Allison devotes a lot of time to, a lot of it based on the Higher Education Price Index and all sorts of information that's gathered from varied sources as a best predictor for how the budget climate will look for the upcoming fiscal year. And then in January, February, it's time that the Budget and Finance typically will review this HEPI, the Higher Education Price Index, and make recommendations about the FY24 dues. And the HEPI functions kind of like the Consumer Price Index, but it's more specific for higher education, which is a distinct ecosystem. The ACRL board is authorized to raise dues up to the HEPI index, and after Budget and Finance reviews dues in January, February, the board will take action at its spring meeting, so any changes can be presented at the annual meeting. Next slide. And so a continuation of the timeline. In the spring, this team will revise the budget based on the Budget and Finance's discussions in January or February. And at the annual meeting, Budget and Finance will make final changes and present it, well, at least expectation is the Budget and Finance will make final changes and present to the board a recommendation to approve the budget. The absent, well, a couple of things, the pandemic slowed things considerably, and the absence of timely financial reports can sometimes delay that approval. And so this year is a good example of that we needed to have more information before we felt comfortable approving the final budget. ALA doesn't approve the ALA budget as a whole until usually around October or so. So that gives us a little bit of time. But in addition to the development of the budget for the coming year, Budget and Finance is also looking back at the previous year's budget, the performance and monitoring the current year, which is why it's so important that we have timely financials so that we can see how the current year is unfolding. So you could say that the Budget and Finance is monitoring the overall financial status of ACRL, looking at 3 years simultaneously, looking at the prior year actuals, the current year, whatever we had up to the date, and then trying to look in our crystal ball for the next fiscal year. And throughout the process of creating the FY23 budget, Budget and Finance is responsible for looking at those FY21 and 22, trying to see how we can best move forward. And just as a reiteration, the board and Budget and Finance postponed the 21, 22, and 23 budget approval to late summer so that the budget could be updated to reflect the impact of COVID and because of the delayed financial reports. And it's kind of difficult to know if the budget approval timeline will be adjusted for 24, but the team and I will keep you updated and we'll seek your input throughout the year. And just to sort of underscore this, what we'll talk about a little bit more later, the operating working agreement, is that there will be a concerted effort to align ACRL's budget, well, all the division budget processes with ALA, which are badly out of alignment. And so the hope is that, and this will be at least a 2-year process. The hope is to have aligned budgets in place for the FY25 budget, but ALA will be working closely with the divisions to come up with that budgeting process so that everyone is included in that information sharing. Okay, so financials for ALA. So this is looking at the balance sheet. The next slide. Thank you. So it's helpful, I think, to look at ALA's budget as a whole. While ACRL is typically looking at its annual operating budget and net asset balance, ALA is looking at the entire balance sheet, and this includes the long-term investments of the endowments. And so this slide illustrates ALA's assets, which include the choice office, and its liabilities. Just as a reminder, the ALA headquarters building was sold in December 2019, and the new office space was leased in Chicago. New office space that I don't think everyone on the team has actually been to. So I think we moved, when I started the job, there were boxes piled everywhere because we had moved everything from the old office to the new office, and then everything shut down. So we'll be looking forward to returning and seeing the space or seeing it for the first time in some cases. But once you take away all these liabilities and so forth, that's what you see in the net assets. Okay. So this is just looking at the total ALA revenue, and so you can see that broken down by these sort of main revenue streams: publishing, conference, membership dues, division income. You can see division income of this 10,773,000 is a large portion of the revenue stream for ALA, the roundtables and the grants. And then a big one that you can see, the grant payroll protection program loan forgiveness of $4,213,000. I mean, that's we're not going to see that again, or at least I don't expect we'll see it again for FY23. So that's something that we'll want to keep in mind going ahead. And next slide. And then here are the total expenses. So you can see the expenses for the publishing, for the conferences, and that can depending on whether it's a in-person or a virtual conference, that can vary considerably. So if you do a virtual conference, you don't have the expenses of an in-person meeting. You don't have the revenue either, but usually it's a pretty good net gain for that when it's a virtual conference. You can see the expenses for the divisions, for the roundtables, and for the grants. But we have, I can provide that further information on that. Here are the general fund revenues. Okay, let's see if there we go. Thank you. So the total ALA assets made 2021, I think, would include all of the income that we and less expenses for that. You'll see, I believe this has the interest income and investment earnings. You can see that's 2,221,906. The divisions can earn interest on the endowments, and that's something that we can talk about a little bit later. But one of the things that we wanted to make clear about these interest income from the long-term investments is that is something that was raised this past or for this upcoming fiscal year. It used to be that the divisions had pretty much full autonomy about how this interest income would be used or not used. In some cases, ACRL would choose not to take the draw and just let the investments grow. But this new budgeting climate with ALA there are more directions about how the long-term investments, the interest from those are being used. And so that'll be something that we'll continue to discuss as we work through this operating agreement. Next slide. So you can see here, hoping the print's not too small, see the total ALA revenue and expenses for a 4-year period. And just reminding you that the FY23 budget has not been approved, so those numbers will certainly change. As we mentioned earlier, the budget is typically reviewed after the annual conference, and it's subject to revisions based on the previous year's fourth quarter revenue and expenses and other factors that come into play. As I mentioned, the ALA budget is typically approved in the fall, in October. In the past, ACRL board has approved the budget at the annual conference, but COVID-19 and delayed financials, same thing that I mentioned earlier, and other things of unknown quality and quantity, the board plans to approve the ACRL budget in late summer of 2022. And that'll be coming up soon. I probably will be doing that in August next month. So you can see for 23, ACRL's budgeted revenue will be, well, I'm not sure if you can see it here, it'll be 2,211,555. Choices budgeted revenue 2,242,842. And that represents almost 40% of the division's combined revenue of $12 million. And somewhat related to the long-term investments of the net asset balances. In the past, the divisions could use their net asset balances to invest in membership or strategic initiatives or capacity building for new programs, et cetera. But the availability of those assets is currently uncertain. I actually had we had a division leaders meeting this morning, and I asked Dina Sordinas, what is the fate of the net asset balances? And they still are tracking them carefully. But Dina's she started in December, and so this idea of divisions having their own assets was new to her, and she's still, I think, trying to wrap her head around it. But it looks like, and this is still uncertain, that there's going to be a determination that divisions can move net asset balances into long-term investments at some point. But that, again, is very preliminary. And you know, I mean, I'd ask Dina, why are you tracking these net asset balances if we don't have access to them? and they recognize that this is revenue that's been generated by the divisions, and that they want to honor that. But there'll be, I'm sure there'll be a lot more coming with that. So next slide. So here are the total projected ALA revenues. So you can see from the general fund, from the divisions, the round tables, grants and awards, and the endowment itself. And just the ALA has I'm not sure if it's conservative or not, but they have an unusual way to calculate the what they draw from the endowment. It's a 20-quarter average. Typically, there's a 3-year average for a lot of groups, and this is done just to try to smooth out bumps in the stock market. But this is a 5-year average that they draw, and so we each year we get the 20-quarter average, and then it's typically a fairly conservative percentage draw of 4%. Although I think this past year it's been 5%. Okay, next slide. So here's sort of a graphic visual representation of the rather of the revenue, and you can see the largest slice here is the mustard colored, the division revenue, followed by the publishing, and then the annual conference in that sort of rust color, and then the membership in the gray. And this is just kind of a pie view, I guess, of the of revenue, gross revenue. Okay, so let's see, financials and divisions. Okay, so next slide, please, Lois. Thank you. So this gives you an idea of the division's revenue. And again, 23 is just a projection. And you can see that ACRL and Choice's combined revenue for 21 is $5,557,373, represents the majority of the revenue. And even in 21 was a meeting year, a virtual meeting year, I should say. But even in an off meeting year, the FY22 projected revenue of $4,457,999 for ACRL and Choice does represent the lion's share of revenue. One thing you'll be seeing later on in Allison's presentation are these spikes and valleys in our revenue streams. We see these spikes with the meeting years where we generate a lot of revenue from the biennial meeting, also generate a lot of expense, but it's that biennial meeting that is a really important source of revenue for ACRL. And next slide. So here are the FY21-23 division expenses, and you can see that ACRL and Choice, the combined expenses in 21 were about $4,434,256, which is less than half of the division expenses. And that represents a net revenue of over $1 million, $1,123,117. But just this slide here, and again, we'll be sharing these slides with you, so you don't have to write all this down, can kind of give you how the different divisions, and there's including the Association of Specialized Government and Cooperative Library Agencies and Choice, which aren't really formally divisions, but there are you can see the 8 divisions of ALA here. Next slide. Okay, and so here are the net revenue among all the divisions. And so again, you can see that ACRL and Choice in FY21 accounted for about $1,123,117 of the net, which is some 62% of the total. So it's important. Again, going back to the aligning the budget with ALA, it's important that there be that alignment, because the financial, the revenue and the expenses are consequential in the ALA universe. Next slide. Thank you. So here's the overhead that was paid, and tried to give a we have a 5-year projection. So anything 23 and beyond is a projection of ALA is trying to anticipate what overhead costs will be. What we'll talk about a little bit more in the operating working agreement is this phrase of eliminating overhead. And as you all know, overhead doesn't disappear. It's always there because you need to have staff to run HR and IT and all those different things. But we're going to, it's going to be refigured how that's calculated. One of the things that is currently being done is the divisions are paying about 50% of overhead on publishing, and Choice, is a reminder, it's based in Connecticut, and one of the reasons that Choice is in Connecticut and not in Chicago with ALA is that there was a conscious decision to try to separate Choice from Booklist. That Choice was for academic and research libraries, and Booklist was for more public libraries and school libraries. And so this physical distance was a way of trying to, which was, and is also close to the New York City Publishing Center, so that had something to do with it too. But Choice is unique in ALA. There is a Washington office for ALA, but it doesn't have the same conditions as Choice does. So they have their own information technology, their own phone system, their own computer system. And so one of the things that we'll be very careful about moving ahead is how we're going to calculate Choice's overhead in this new operating agreement. Okay, next slide. Okay, I think that you probably have had enough of listening to me, and I think Allison can take up on the major revenue and expenses.
All right, thanks so much, Jay. I do want to just share that we are saving questions to the end. So if you have any questions, there will be opportunity for you to ask any questions at the end of the presentation. You can also enter those into the chat during the presentation. We'll address those at the end. All right, so yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about ACRL's financials and our major revenues and expenses. So we have our major revenues, which are presented typically in 3 categories. So we see our membership dues, publications, so that includes our serials as well as our non-serial publications, our education, which includes the ACRL conference, webinars, and that kind of stuff. Then we also have major expenses, which follows the same categories, as well as special projects, and then ALA overhead that is paid to the bigger organization. So ACRL must generate our revenues. There is no allocation from ALA, which is really important to note. So our indirect cost rate, also known as overhead, is 26.4%, and it's remained that percentage for the past few years. We have not been given the overhead rate for fiscal year 24, so that will be to be determined. So the business rules are spelled out in the ALA operating agreement, which is currently under review. The operating agreement governs who pays for what between ALA and its divisions. Grants are an occasional source of revenue. We currently don't have any grants within ACRL, but we have had grants in the past. The ACRL budget includes, like I said, our major revenues, our major expenses, and then at the end, the net revenues. We also include the opening net asset balance and the closing net asset balance. So the healthy operating balance, past positive net revenue, and the long-term investment fund is thanks to careful stewardship, which allows us to have deficit budgets, which that is kind of up in there, as Jay mentioned, due to the discussion of what the future of the net asset balance is. So we are beginning to budget appreciation on long-term investments as an additional source of revenue. In the past few years, we have taken the long-term investments. As Jay noted earlier in the conversation, there is a mandate that we are expecting for, I believe it's fiscal year 23, to take part of the long-term investment interest into the operating budget. Okay, next slide, please. Thanks. So here we have that chart that Jay was talking about with the revenue sources. It shows the peaks and valleys. So in the odd years, we have a peak with the ACRL conference, which is that green line showing our education. and then the valleys in the odd years when we don't have a conference. So the other lines, membership dues, publications, donations, those kind of follow a steady line. Though I do want to point out, so it looks like publications, we've had a little bit of a decline. And then membership dues, a little bit of a decline, but we have been slightly increasing membership dues for the past for the past recent years. So that kind of has negated some of the decline in the numbers. Okay, so here we have figure 3, which shows the big picture. We have our conference revenues. We also have our conference total expenses, and then the conference net revenue. What's really important to point out here is that purple bar, the net revenue. In the fiscal year 21 budget, we were expecting a very small net revenue, and that is decreasing. And that's mostly due to, we can see where the overhead to pay to ALA is affecting our overall net for the conference. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned how the membership numbers are decreasing. We can see how it is a little distressing to see how we've gone from 13K members in 2007 before the 2008 recession, and now we are down to 8,000 members showing in 2021. And it kind of follows the same trend. You can see that the ALA membership numbers are also declining. Though in that big drop 2021 to or 2020 to 2021, that is a pretty drastic drop. So that will be a point for the board and the budget committee to consider new ways to engage members and to consider other sources of revenue. Okay, so the cost of member services shows just only the member services revenues as well as the expenditures. You can see most years the expenditures of member services far outweighs the cost of the revenue generated. So when there are other strong revenue sources to support those services, this is not a problem. Now that other revenues are down, it is challenging to continue supporting member services expenses. So ACRL relies more and more on the ACRL conference revenue to support other initiatives. Member expenses include non-revenue generating programs and services. Oh, I think we're still on the cost of member services, thanks. Member services, okay, include non-revenue generating programs and services. So that includes advocacy, board of directors, chapters, committees, sections, advisory services, standards, discussion groups, awards, non-serial publications, information literature, scholarly communication, and more. So the new due setting mechanism gives the Budget and Finance Committee and the board a way to regularly increase dues and to try to keep up with expenses. All right, so I'll go ahead and transition over to Jay, who will talk more about long-term investments.
Thank you, Allison. And one of the things, I guess, just to note from this last graph about revenue and expenses for membership, I mean, the FY21 was sort of an outlier there, and that was in part because we didn't have the expenses of an in-person meeting for Seattle. So thank you. And so that's as Allison said, is really indicative of the impact that the biennial meeting has on our budgeting. Okay, so to the endowment fund. Thank you. So these are the historical cash flows as of May 31st. And you can see I mean, I like to, I used to work with an organization where they just said, let's just buy bonds. The stock market's too risky, which is really a poor financial strategy. And so you can see in the blue line that stock market has done pretty remarkable, especially when you consider that a lot of the increase here was in the middle of a pandemic. Lately, it's not been as remarkable, but still, I think overall you can look and see at these historic gains. The book value that you see, this sort of tan or ecru space down here, that tracks if you took all of ALA's assets and subtracted all the liabilities, the book value is what you would get. So you can still see that there's pretty healthy. I think that Tracy Hall wants to increase both the ecru line and the blue line through donations. Okay, next slide. And so you can see the ACRL endowment, the fund market value. One thing to note is that $350,000 of ACRL's increase in FY18 was a swap to fund the new choice business initiatives. We also, and this was one of the beauties of the net asset balances, we were able to use that to help Choice purchase its office space in Middletown, Connecticut. And just one of the many things we're able to do with the net asset balances. But you can see that rather than just buying bonds or putting the money under a mattress, that the endowment fund has done very well. Next slide. And then here's the Choice Endowment Fund. Again, the swap of $350,000 for the business initiatives, and which with the appreciation was really only a $308,000 reduction rather than $350,000 reduction. So not Choice Endowment is not nearly as robust as ACRL's alone, but still in positive territory here. Next slide. So this is the what Allison had referred to and what I had mentioned earlier about the new long-term investment mandate. So in April 2022, ALA divisions were informed 5%, and this was something that had to be approved by the ALA board, long-term investment mandate, and that the rather than us being able to create a deficit budget as we had done with FY22, which is a deficit budget in excess of 700,000, ALA is looking for budget surplus. And so a lot of it, the mechanics I think have to be worked out, because a single year budget surplus doesn't take into account 2-year cycles that we're used to. So taking the long-term investment interest income has not been mandated in the past. It was up to the divisions to decide how that was going to be done. And there's been some tension about this. Those of you who are continuing on budget and finance will recall that Public Library Association was particularly upset about the direction or the directive of how these long-term investments would be used, and asked ACRL to join in a joint letter to ALA President Patty Wong, protesting that this directive of how the long-term investments would be used was in contradiction to the operating agreement under which we were working. And so that's something that we're still working out. That will be, I think, determined by the group looking at the recommendations of the operating agreement working group. If we don't, as is obvious, if we don't take the long-term investment, then that money can stay in the endowment and continue to grow, or at least the hope is it will grow. Some years it doesn't grow, but that's kind of the state of the play with the long-term investments, and along with the net asset balances, I think are the two big financial points for how the operating agreement will look moving ahead. Okay. So operating agreement. So as we embark on these change streams, it's expected that if divisions continue in a similar structure, the business rules between ALA and the 8 divisions will be reimagined, will be renegotiated. And the current rules and again, ALA is, in some cases we say unique. I'm not sure if we're unique, but certainly unusual in having a single 501c3 with divisions with a pretty good deal of autonomy under which they've operated in the past. So I think that that autonomy is now, how much autonomy the divisions have is now what's part of the moving ahead with the operating agreement. This autonomy, or the current operating agreement, was really ratified back in '89. And you can, Kara Malenfant was one of the members of the working group, and there were things in there such as that didn't include websites, and there were lots of things about 9-pin printers and stuff like that. So it was good to update it, and a lot of the outdated information has been removed, and so the revised operating agreement that was presented this past June is much slimmer than it was. But just the initial an operating agreement from '89 was just setting forth a relationship among ALA and the divisions. So one legal organization with divisional autonomy. And this, I think, is, it's interesting to note that ACRL was the first division at ALA, and the records I've read just suggest that ACRL leaders back in the '40s were insistent that ALA provide more resources for those who were involved in research and academic libraries, which was a huge portion of ALA membership. And so it's been evolving since then, since ACRL became an official division at ALA. But I think the operating agreements had recognized that there's a dynamic relationship between ALA and the divisions, and it's something that certainly you want to have collaboration, and you want to work together, because each helps the other considerably. But it's taken a couple of years to look at the operating agreement and try to figure out how to move forward. And my sense was there was a degree of exhaustion from the current operating agreement working group of how can we get this thing possibly done. So I'll be curious to see how the recommendations that were passed along to the ALA board this past June, that there is a plan for them to be implemented, as I said earlier. And that goes to the different committees, COO being one of them. So, so just kind of in shorthand here, for the operating agreement lays out the relationship between ALA and the 8 divisions. There used to be 11 divisions, as some of you will remember, but a few of those collapsed into core. So looking essentially at the terms under which the services will be provided free of charge or at cost, which services the divisions must use, and how divisions will support ALA mission financially, and then define the roles and responsibilities and policy implementation. And this is something that it's not just cultural tensions at play here, that our members representing research in college, college libraries, that culture is distinct from, say, Public Library Association. There are also services of which ALA is providing, HR, IT, et cetera, that we really are hoping can become improved in many ways, so that we have confidence that we can move forward with budgeting and with business with as much support as possible. So I'm going to hand it back over to Allison, who can talk about overhead.
Okay, I can go ahead and take these slides. Let me just bring back the overhead slide. Okay, so here we have a very long history of what the overhead rate has been. I mentioned previously that it had been 26.5 for the past recent years. You can see that it dropped as low as 18.85% in fiscal year 05, but it's still TBD for fiscal year 24. And then typically we do get a 2-year advance notice, but it's still pending for next year, next fiscal year. Okay, next slide, please. So here we have the overhead comparison. You can see how much ALA publishing pays, ALA conferences, so that does not include the ACRL conference. And then divisions, you can see that there's a bigger increase for overhead in the even years. That's because the PLA conference is held that year in even years, which does generate slightly more revenue than the ACRL conference. And then we have our roundtables, ALA grants and awards, and then the total. All right. And I will go ahead and transfer it back over to Jay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And just to you don't have to go back, Lois, but just to sort of reiterate what Allison said about the even fiscal years. It's not just PLA that has its conference, and I was able to attend the PLA conference in thank you, Lois, in Portland earlier in the spring, which was their first in person in quite a while. And it is a huge production, and I mean, there were lots of costs that you don't typically see, such as vaccination requirements and things like that. So it didn't make as much as typically, but there's also the Association of School Librarians. They have their conference in the even numbered fiscal years. So you have those two division conference streams that are going into the into that single even numbered fiscal year. So something to keep in mind. Okay, all right, so we can go ahead. Thank you, Lois. So the total ACRL unit overhead to ALA. So again, you can see the familiar mountain range here based on the conference years. And this has, and it's fairly dramatic to see the peaks and valleys compared to Choice, which of course has no conference. And so how it's steady, or much steadier than or much more horizontal than ACRL. But you can notice that Choice, it is a sort of a slow decline in the looking ahead, our current FY21, and then looking ahead. And this is partly of what Mark Cummings was trying to correct, recognizing that subscriptions to Choice, that the model that academic librarians were using Choice to build their collections, that no longer is sustainable. And so that's the pivot of Choice to this Choice 360, where they are attracting sponsors for webinars and really helping the academic and university library communities in many ways, with lots and lots of views, tens of thousands of views of their webinars. And I just saw recently a comparison of Choice's customers, as they call them, rather than members, with ACRL members, and there's not as much overlap as I would have thought. So there's a real potential to, even though Choice subscription revenue is declining and probably will continue to decline, there's a real opportunity to engage more people who are involved in what we do in research and academic libraries. Okay, so let's see, next slide. So just listing some practical implications here. So in the past, the divisions could carry over their net assets. ALA would earn interest on these assets, but the general fund units, such as publishing and conferences, they contribute their excess revenue to the general fund and start over every year. And as Allison mentioned earlier, this policy of carrying over net assets has allowed ACRL to have deficit budgets in the past, and also to invest in things like project outcome and benchmarks. And it's also created some tension between staff and general funds and staff and divisions because of what we were talking about earlier, meeting timely financials and things like that. So in preparation of the ALA's annual budget, the ALA Executive Director, Tracy, is authorized to include a payout rate of 3% to 5% of the 5-year trailing calendar, the 20-quarter average I was talking about earlier, of the net asset balance of the ALA Future Fund. And additionally, this annual payout rate of 3 to 5% will be reviewed, determined, and recommended by the ALA endowment trustees. There's a special trustee group and the Finance and Audit Committee of the ALA Executive Board, with the final approval by the Executive Board of ALA. Recently, ACRL was able to budget about $135,000 in appreciation from the long-term investments in FY19. ACRL was able to transfer $125,500 in interest and appreciation from its long-term investment. And we did this for the first time to ensure the slowdown of spending down the net asset balance, which so it would just be a less abrupt. And just as a reminder, that net asset balance back in FY16, 17 or so was in excess of $5 million. And so that was an intentional part of ACRL to spend that money and not let it just accumulate over time, and spend it wisely in things like project outcome and benchmark. Okay, so next slide for the operating agreement working group. So as we talked about, the ALA Executive Board appointed this working group to evaluate, assess, and make recommendations to the ALA operating agreement that defines this relationship between ALA and the divisions. And the working group really wanted to look at how the existing operating agreement, some of this is repeating, but I think it bears repeating, is fulfilling the mission and values of the association, as well as the financial structure that supports the joint and individual goals of the association and the divisions. And also the working group examined the relationship between ALA and the roundtables so as to provide recommendations that guide that relationship as well. And again, the operating agreement values this unity, diversity, authority, autonomy, and collaboration. So those values, I think, were always in the back of their minds as the working group members were trying to pull these things together. So just to kind of give you a rough timeline of how things were and how they are, the working group was approved by the Executive Board back in May of 2020, so just a little over 2 years ago. And that same month, volunteers were solicited for the working group. And in June, the group was appointed by the Executive Board. They had their first meeting in July of 2020. I think the expectation was they would finish in a year, but that was unrealistic. And so the ALA Executive Board extended the working group's term to June 2022. And then this past month, the term ended, and they did submit their recommendations to the ALA Executive Board. And as a reminder, Maggie Farrell, who was our treasurer, was co-chair, and Andrew Pace was also co-chair. And these, as I mentioned earlier, Karen Malone was part of this working group, and Maggie singled out Kara specifically at the DC meeting, saying that her historical knowledge and her insights were really valuable for the working group, and she was careful to thank Kara for that. So the hope is that the recommendations will facilitate member engagement and seek to broaden the perspectives of divisions and ALA by getting a variety of opinions and ideas. And so that's, but that's something, the recommendations are there, they've been delivered. And so we'll see how that those recommendations are carried out through the various governance mechanisms of ALA. They want to be careful in how they proceed with that. Okay, the next slide. So here are the recommendations. So the board accepts the final report and presents the rewritten policy and outline changing internal processes and procedures to ALA Committee on Organization, COOP. for their review. So this is how the process will unfold. If the new policy is approved, and there's an if there, authorize an implementation task force, which is, I think, familiar to everyone, to develop a new budget process. And this budget process, I think, will be largely driven internally with Executive Director Hall and the divisions and the units, and aligning those, especially with Dina Sordinas, the CFO. And then the Executive Board is encouraging the Executive Director of ALA to form an internal working group to revise operational practices that update and include accountability and service expectations. And that's part of the tension, I think, of that letter I mentioned earlier about the long-term investments that went to Patty Wong, that there is a desire that these I don't know if disagreement is the right word, but the protests, maybe that's a better word, of how we're being asked, how the current operating agreement doesn't seem to be in play, it doesn't seem to be enforced. And so this whole question of what's practice and what's policy arose. And so that's the hope is that disagreements about long-term investments, about net asset balances and so forth can be handled through division directors with Executive Director of ALA. But this is something I still want to kind of push back on, and that especially for things like net asset balances, is that we have an operating agreement that is in play and that should be adhered to, and it doesn't seem to be. And so that's we're in that sort of liminal stage that is always sort of an interesting place to be. Okay, so let's see, next slide. So the bottom line, ACRL and choice. And Allison, were you going to take this one up?
Yeah,
Or?
I think those are my slides. I can take them. Thanks,
Okay.
Jay. I do want to go back just real quick to the operating agreement work group slide just to emphasize. So we're still waiting on our liaison from the ALA Executive Board to be assigned, but the Budget and Finance Committee and the board actually meets with the liaison 2 times a year, January and in June. So that'll be a really good opportunity to ask any questions about the operating agreement and any of these changes within ALA. And that first bullet point, continued association-wide feedback. So the board and the Budget and Finance Committee, I would expect to be should expect to be involved with that association-wide feedback. And then, okay, thanks. Okay, so here we have the ACRL and choice net asset balances and the long-term investments. This is based on the fiscal year 22 opening balance. You can see we have 3.3 million in our net asset balance. So that's what Jay was mentioning, that is kind of up for debate if it exists, if we have access to, but as of now, per the operating agreement, we do have access to have a deficit budget to invest those in programs and services like project outcomes, benchmarks, scholarships, and that kind of stuff. And then we also have $5.2 million in our long-term investments, and that's the unrestricted, or it's not awards related for our fund balances. In recent years, the market, as we know, has done really well. And currently it's not doing so great, so I'm not quite sure when we'll get the actual interest rate for the LTI, but that will be to be determined. Okay, so here we have ACRL net asset balance over the years, as well as the long-term investment fund balances. You can see how we've had that really healthy net asset balance, which is that blue line from fiscal year 11 or fiscal year 12 through fiscal year 17. That drop off is when the board and the Budget and Finance Committee made a conscious decision to invest some of that net asset balance to kind of spend down because it had gotten too high. And then in fact, in the past, I think it was probably around fiscal year 15 or 16, we had a budget and finance committee working group who really took a lot of time to examine what would be the appropriate fund balance for ACRL, and then they made a recommendation on the spend down. Okay, so we're in the home stretch now, so I'll just wrap up with a little bit about reporting. So each quarter, ACRL prepares a quarterly financial report. It's pretty basic with our detailed, well, it can be, there's a high level executive summary, which includes the overall revenues that are kind of split in those three major categories that I mentioned previously. So publications, membership, and education. So we always have our revenues at the top, the expenses, and then the net revenues at the very bottom. And this quarterly report also includes our long-term investment fund balances. And there's also always a narrative cover memo written by Jay, which will highlight the trends, provide any discrepancies or explanations that you might see in that spreadsheet. Okay, go ahead, next slide, please. So here's just a screen grab of what the quarterly report looks like. At the top, we have our beginning reserves. You can see that where the revenues are broken down to the major categories. And then we also include the budgeted, the quarterly budget, the quarterly actual, and then the variance. And then we compare it against the budget or the actuals from 2 years ago. And we do that as the conferences once every other year. And then for choices budget, we compare against just the last fiscal year since they do not have a conference. So here's just the next slide, please. So this is just the continuation of the quarterly. This is the second page of the quarterly report, which just includes the expenses. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the third page of the quarterly report, which will always include the nets at the end of the quarter, any operating transfers, the long-term transfers, gains, losses, and then what's really important to note are the ending reserves. Okay, next slide, please. So here's the dashboard metrics. This started as a budget and finance working group project, a recommendation to kind of create an overview snapshot. It's actually 2 pages of really important trends. So this one shows membership trends that the budget committee identified as important information that they would like to see. This is also shared with the board of directors. And then the second page has fund balance, just a snapshot of the fund balance and how that's comparing over the years. And I think there's a couple of charts regarding the long-term investment. Unfortunately, due to financial delays in reporting, we have not been doing this since the data is pretty far delayed. Okay, so here we have an infographic, which also was a result of a budget and finance working group recommendation. And it was just kind of a recommendation to give a good snapshot of how we're investing our money for a fiscal year, or I think this might actually be 2 fiscal years because of the conference. And it's broken down by strategic areas. So we have, since this was for, I think, fiscal year 21, the equity, diversity, and inclusion is not included as a strategic area, but we do have the 4 other goal areas such as student learning, value of academic libraries, research and scholarly environment, new roles, and changing landscapes. And then we also pulled out how much we spend to support membership and how much we spend to support conferences and professional development. Again, due to financial delays, we have not completed this in recent fiscal years, but we really hope that once ALA Finance catches up, that we can resume this infographic in the future. Okay, so Jay mentioned previously that the budget packet can be quite large, so I wanted to kind of go over just what the individual project budgets look like. So each of our projects, we have about 40 separate accounts. So each one supports a very specific project. So we have, here we have our membership. So we have it broken down on the top with the revenues. The bottom part of this spreadsheet will show the expenses, and then the end will show the net. And it includes the last few fiscal years of actuals as well as the recent year's budget. So other projects include like new roles and changing landscapes, value of academic libraries. We also have individual projects for each of our serial publications and non-serial publications. Okay, so this is just the bottom half of the membership project spreadsheet. So it shows our expenses, and we do include quite a bit of notes and details. So if you're ever curious, like how much we spend on a particular project or what that money is going to or where the revenue is coming from, there will be a detailed note that will explain what our expenses and revenues are for. All right, next slide. We also include with our full budget packet a historical executive summary, so you can really see broken down in the major categories, the actuals from the recent fiscal years. And it's the same thing. It's broken down into revenues at the top, expenses on the bottom, and then the nets at the bottom. Okay, so at this point, I'll transfer over to Jay to do the last few slides.
Thank you, Allison. So we're nearing the end point here, so yeah, can take a deep breath. So just to recapitulate, this is a recap of the projects that are outlined in the Budget and Finance's annual work plan. And so just items 1 through 12, as we talked about earlier, for FY23, we want to be looking at developing the budget assumptions for the FY24 budget. In fiscal year 23, we'll be making those assumptions for FY24, monitor Choice's financial outlook. And as I mentioned, it's important that we pay particular attention to Choice, and Rachel, our interim publisher, has some really good ideas about how to make Choice financially viable. I've spoken to Tracy Hall, and she hasn't given me a set number of years about how long we have to make Choice more profitable. But we certainly, Choice will not be able to endure if it continues to have deficit budgets. I think this year for 22, I think we're fine that Choice is going to show a surplus, and FY23 is looking promising. But any ideas that you all have that we can do to help Choice become profitable, they'll be most welcome. We'll continue evaluation of the dashboard metrics. I know that this is important to Joe, and I'm hoping that with the promise of more timely financials, that we'll be able to have that, because I think the dashboard is pretty important, especially when you have this much information. The dashboard is important in trying to get a sense of what's going on with the budget. The dues rate review and recommendations for FY24, we'll have those. You may recall that there was based on the Higher Education Price Index, there was a recommendation that we raised the dues $2, and the board questioned if that was appropriate given the inflation that was taking hold then. So the decision was made to raise dues $1, and that I think it's important for Budget and Finance to recognize that dues, if you raise them $2, then that has effect on upcoming budget cycles. If you raise them $1, also has an effect. And so it's not just what you're going to be looking at for the fiscal year that you raise the dues, it's also subsequent fiscal years as well. So it's a pretty profound effect. We'll look at the Friends disbursement and fundraising activities, and that's something that's really important to me, is to try to work closely with ALA with development and to encourage giving to ACRL. And I gave a brief presentation at the Budget and Finance meeting in December and at the District of Columbia to try to outline some of the ideas for that. We also want to advise the board on the long-term investment transfers. As we talked about, that advisement is in the new operating agreement is I think ALA always welcomes that advising, but it doesn't seem to be as straightforward as it was in the past. As the budget and finance would say, let's do this, and board would say yes, and that was done. We'll want to conduct orientation for new board members and new budget finance members. So this is what we're doing now, and thank you for being here. Monitor the effects of the discounted $5 student dues on membership. That's, as you know, was this low dues rate was to try and encourage student membership, which I think has been successful in some parts. The pandemic has interfered, I think, with that. Continue to evaluate infographics showing the members how ACRL revenues are used to support programs and services. And so with more timely financials, we'll be able to do that in a much clearer way. Monitor the level of the net asset balances and stay abreast of ALA finances and organizational effectiveness. And finally, consider how ACRL can financially support its core commitment to EDI. And and as a reminder, the core commitment, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Committee is now transitioning from core commitment committee to a goal area committee, as Allison pointed out. And so we're in the process now of trying to devise the goal and objectives for that, and actually have a meeting this Friday with the chairs of EDI to try to move that forward. Okay, so let's see, next meetings. Okay, so thank you, Lois. So virtual orientation, so you only need to attend one. So if you made it through this one, congratulations. You don't have to go through another one. And then the virtual meeting, so that's coming right up August 3rd from 2 to 4 Central Time. And then the joint board and budget and finance budget review and action meeting, that's to be determined. And we'll, Allison's very good at doodling to try to get availability. And I do want to just say that, these spreadsheets can look pretty intimidating, but like I said, we're happy to walk through them more carefully with you. And I just want to give a shout out to Allison, who puts these formulas in the spreadsheet that are just remarkable. I mean, it's actually a lot more complicated than it looks, if you can imagine that, because we in ACRL, when we talk about assigning amount of staff effort to a project, we're not guessing. We're putting in these 15-minute increments how much time we're spending on different projects. And so in my calendar each day, I'm careful to allocate the time I'm spending on everything, including orientation for budget and finance. So when we break these projects down for staff costs, these are pretty accurate estimates here. And I'm grateful to Allison for putting all these formulas in there that make this possible for these accurate representations. And it's not just for the spreadsheet, it's also something that she has to do for Profix, which is our budgeting software for ALA, and that requires considerable effort. So thank you to Allison, and thank you to Lois for advancing the slides. And now I haven't looked to see if everyone is still here. I think some of you had to drop out, but now is the time for questions.
Well, thanks, Jay. I actually do want to go back to that. We don't need to share the slides again, but I know there was mention of possibly another meeting in August. I think it's safe to say that we will not have another meeting, and that the August 3rd meeting will be sufficient. There may be an asynchronous virtual vote that might have to take place on ALA Connect, but it is looking like, especially getting so close to August, that the August 3rd meeting should be sufficient.
I know that's disappointing, but yeah, so that's what is that, 56 slides? that's a heap of slides, but again, those will be available to you. Yeah, any questions about
I don't have a question. I just